Hello everyone, welcome to General Psychology, Psychology 101, and today we're going to be talking about brain states and consciousness. Now when we talk about consciousness, we're really talking about kind of a very fundamental yet very slippery concept to define. The original basis of psychology was to study consciousness until behaviorism came around and focused everything on behaviors. But when we talk about consciousness, we are basically trying to get at our awareness of our environment and ourselves. How do we take in all this information and become aware of who we are, what we're doing, why we're thinking, why we're feeling, etc. We can have different states of consciousness, so we can be alert, we can be sleeping, which is kind of coincides with unconscious. We can be daydreaming, we can have altered states when we start talking about the influence that drugs have on our consciousness. And we can study all these different states, and there are certain areas of psychology, such as cognitive neuroscience, for example, which is an interdisciplinary study of brain activity and how it's linked to our specific processes in our brain, our specific mental processes. So these researchers in cognitive neuroscience attempt to relate specific conscious experiences to specific areas of the brain. So for example, what areas of the brain are more active when I'm running or when I'm reading a book? And interestingly enough, some research has found that, say, for example, a woman was asked to think about playing tennis. We see similar areas of the brain light up that coincide with specific muscle movements that you would use when playing tennis, such as arm and leg movements. So in essence, cognitive neuroscientists can read your mind, figure out what you're thinking about just by looking at what areas of your brain are lit up. And conscious experience is only half of the equation. We have our awareness of our surroundings and ourselves, this conscious idea, but we can also have subconscious thoughts and feelings and concepts and awareness. This is kind of this distinction between consciousness and subconsciousness or unconsciousness, different terms for this. Highlights the fact that we are processing things in two different ways at the same time. We have dual processing. Information is simultaneously processed on separate conscious and unconscious or subconscious tracks. So for example, if we see a bird flying, we can consciously label the bird that's flying by saying, hey, look, it's a bird. But we are also subconsciously or unconsciously processing that bird in terms of exactly what it is that we're looking at. So we're focusing on the color, the form, the movement, the distance, for example, of the bird. And as we talked about briefly last week, vision can be both conscious and unconscious. We talked about blind sight, where people couldn't consciously see something that was in their immediate area, but people could unconsciously see it. And they had this different processing system in their brains that allowed them to detect this box that they were about to run into, even though they couldn't actually see it. And most of our everyday thinking occurs outside of our conscious awareness. We're not always in control of our choices that we make or our intentions that we have, of every single movement that we make and every single thought that we might have. And oftentimes consciousness is late to the party, so to speak. Our unconscious can better put things into motion compared to our consciousness. We tend to react to our situations better than compared to when we kind of are thinking through exactly what we're going to be doing. This is the idea of muscle memory. If we perform the same movement over and over again, it starts to become relatively automatic that we perform that movement. We don't necessarily have to think about us actively performing that movement every time. But thankfully, yes, most of our behaviors are relatively automatic, but we do have this manual override of the consciousness. We can and are able to control our behaviors once unconsciously they may have already been put into motion. And although unconscious processing helps us navigate our environments, again, we cannot possibly pay attention to every little detail in the environment, so unconscious processes are great. But our conscious processing is extremely helpful when we're learning new skills or when we're trying to focus our attention on a very specific thing. So when we focus on one thing using our conscious awareness, we can sometimes have what's known as selective attention. And that's when we focus consciously on this very specific aspect of an experience, oftentimes a stimuli, and we are not really aware of anything else that's happening. So a great example of this is through the cocktail party effect. This is when you attend to basically one voice among many. So someone might say your name in a crowded room with everyone talking, but you manage to hear it because that's associated with you. You're more likely to tune into a stimuli in the environment that is self-relevant. One example of selective attention, or one kind of signal of selective attention, is we tend to blink less when we're focusing in on something. So if we're paying attention to someone, say they're talking, then we're not going to blink very much. Whereas if we have a wandering mind, or if we're daydreaming, thinking about something else, we're going to be blinking a lot. Selective attention is great, but it's not so great when we're trying to perform multiple tasks at the same time. And selective attention can actually detract a lot of our focus and ability to concentrate away from a task if we're trying to do multiple things at the same time. So for example, trying to talk on the phone while driving can lead to car crashes and can lead to fatalities. Areas of the brain that we use to drive the car decrease in activity by upwards of 37% when we're also on the phone. And that also includes talking on the phone while not holding it up to your head, wireless, Bluetooth. Again, talking on the phone while driving is very different than talking to someone who's sitting next to you. Passengers can also pay attention to what's happening on the road. They can decide to stop talking if traffic gets a little crazy, or they can help you pinpoint possible issues on the road or possible hazards that you want to avoid. So for those of you who do drive, which is probably all of you at this point, don't talk on the phone. It's not good. Just, you can wait. You can do it. Do it for my sake. Another interesting thing that we see occur due to our selective attention is what's known as inattentional blindness. So when we do focus on this one object, we are pretty much blind to everything else that's going on in the room. And this can be taken advantage of by people trying to sell you things. It can be taken advantage of by, say, magicians with sleight of hand or misdirection. And we see a couple of really interesting phenomena occur. So we have something known as change blindness, where sometimes we're not always aware of small or sometimes large changes in the environment if we're focusing on something else. And we can have choice blindness, which is sometimes if we make a choice that really doesn't matter, a menial choice, sometimes we will forget which option we chose and kind of go with the other option after we've already made a decision. And lastly, due to this idea that we focus on things that are self-relevant or stand out in the crowd, such as hearing our name, that's an example of the pop-out effect. And that's when we're kind of forced to pay attention to something that stands out from the crowd, that is distinctive from everything else. So we may see in a sea of frowning faces one smiling face. Our attention is drawn to that smiling face because it is distinct from everything else. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for your time and attention. Hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.